and you find it helpful to follow along, please turn in it to Luke the 19th chapter. This is where we will spend our time. Jesus is coming to Jerusalem, but this is not his first trip. If you remember Luke 13, you remember this, where Jesus stood over the city one time before. And he said, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those who are sent to you, how often I would have gathered you together as a hen gathers her brood, but you would not. Behold, your house is left to you desolate. And I tell you the truth, you will not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." And that day has come. Jesus has come back to Jerusalem. So let's take a look at the text. There are several components in it, and we're going to try our best to look at all of them today. I'll begin reading in Luke 19, verse 41. When Jesus approached the city and saw it, he wept over it, saying, "If you'd only known this day, even you, the things that make for peace, but now those things are hidden from you. For the days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and surround you on every side. They will demolish you, you and your children within your walls. They will not leave one stone stacked upon another, because you did not recognize the time of your visitation by God." Then Jesus entered the temple courts and began to drive out all of those who were selling things there, saying to them, "It's written, my house will be a house of prayer, but you've turned it into a den of robbers." Jesus was teaching daily in the temple courts after these things. The priests, the experts in the law, and all the prominent Jewish leaders among the people were seeking to have him killed. But they couldn't find a way to do that because the people hung on his every word. Now, this text has several components, and I don't want to neglect any of them. They're significant in that here Jesus is, he's above the city, Mount of Olives, and he can look out and he can see the whole city spread out in front of him. And this is one of those texts where you see Jesus operating in both ways. He operates as Jesus the man, but he's also operating as Yahweh, God Almighty in the flesh, because he's saying things that have not happened and are not going to happen for 30 some odd years. He knows that they're going to happen, which, as someone asked in Sunday school today, or maybe it was during the prayer time, it was Nancy during prayer time, how come God doesn't just stop all of this violence? If he does that, then he has to intervene in such a way as to take away human freedom. And he, as God, is looking over the city, just like in the time of Samuel. Remember, in the time of Samuel, there they were. Think of how great this would be if that were today. They had Samuel, a judge. Now, ostensibly, the judges were those who heard straight from God. And Samuel was the leader of the nation, right? But they said, we don't like this arrangement. The Jewish people looked around them and they saw all the kings, Assyria, the Babylonians who would come, the Philistines, the Egyptians. They said, we want to be like all these other nations. We want a king. And God said, I want to be your king. They said, that's nice, but it's not working in the way we want it to be. So will you bring us a king? And God did it. He said, okay, I'll give you Saul. And you see then, from the rest of the time on the earth, the Jewish history is different. Because now the person through whom God is going to speak, Samuel, Deborah, Gideon, so forth, they're not there anymore. Now there's a king. And once you establish a kingdom, it's Rex Lex. The king is law. And so the prophet could come in there and say something, but the king got the final word. No longer does God have the final word for the nation anymore. That day is over once there's a kingdom. And look at the disasters that came through their history after that. Jesus weeps over the city, and he weeps over it. This is God Almighty. Because he knows what's coming. He knows that starting only 3 or 4 years after Jesus is crucified and raised from the dead, there's going to be Jewish unrest. And that unrest will occur time and time and time. Part of it even involved Pontius Pilate. I don't know if you're aware of that. If you read Josephus and his history of the Jewish nation, there was trouble with Pontius Pilate right after the crucifixion. These troubles continue through all of the governors that are appointed by Rome to oversee Israel. Felix, the slave governor, who shows up in the New Testament in the book of Acts. Trouble, 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 until finally, 66 AD, some Greeks sacrifice some animals, some birds, on the steps of the temple as pagans, desecrating the temple, and the Jews explode into unrest. And then you see 4 years of warfare until finally just what Jesus says is going to happen. This is exactly the way it went. You look at the verses here where this is like a lament from Jeremiah. Where Jeremiah, God had told Jeremiah what was going to happen. And they wouldn't listen to Jeremiah. They said, no, we're going to be out of this Babylonian captivity in 2 years. And Jeremiah says, no. It's going to be 70 years. You better just go ahead and plant your vineyards and marry your children off and do all the things you normally do and pray for the peace of Babylon because you're going to be here a long time. Again, here Jesus is as God looking at the city, knowing the destruction that's going to come. Well, it did come. 66 AD, all the unrest occurred. The emperor at the time sends Titus, General Titus. General Titus comes. He pleads with the Jews. They didn't just come in with guns or swords ablazing, I guess, at that time in history. They didn't come in with the shields flickering and the swords ablazing. They came in and there were emissaries sent to the Jewish people to say, please don't do this. We don't want this for you. Titus pled with them. All the armies are assembled. The Jews can see them. They know that this is fixing to happen. Something military is fixing to happen. Well, they wouldn't listen to him. So Titus has his orders, right? You're to put a stop to this unrest in the temple area and in Jerusalem. He comes. Josephus records that Titus threw his arms heavenward and asked God to forgive him for what he was about to do to the Jews. Think of that. Titus said, is recorded by Josephus to have said, there is no merit in vanquishing a people who have been forsaken by their God. Titus didn't want any of this. So he comes. They won't listen. He builds just what Jesus said. They'll build an embankment around your city. They did that. They built an earthen embankment all the way around the city. They laid siege to it. And I don't know if you know much about siege warfare, but what your object there is to starve people out. You lay siege, no supplies can come in, the food runs out. They had water because of Hezekiah's tunnel. They had water, they had no food. Titus kept appealing to them. They would not listen. No. There were people inside the city who wanted to come out. Did you know that? Lots of them. Can you imagine being inside the walls of the city and you look out above the walls of Jerusalem and you see this earthen embankment around and Roman soldiers parked there. And then as time went on, you see 10,000 Jews crucified on the earthen embankment. In plain view, they could hear the screams. It's recorded by Josephus. They could hear the people being crucified screaming inside the walls. And every day that's what you wake up to. There's no food, it's all running out, and you've got a family with little children. So you think to yourself, you know what, this is what Titus offered them. He said to them, according to Josephus, and Josephus was there. This isn't something where Josephus remembers something from ancient history. He was there. Josephus was a Jewish famous person, I suppose you'd call him, a Jewish wealthy person who had sided with the Romans, and he was chronicling all of this. Titus offered anybody that would come out of the city amnesty. He said, if you'll come out and surrender, you can go back to your home when this is all over. What a deal. I mean, it was just an open invitation. Some of them tried. You know what happened to them? The zealots inside the city were killing their own so that they would not surrender to the Romans. Now, think about Jesus standing there looking at the city, and he knows all of that's coming. All of it. This is God. There's no question. He's looking at it. He knows what they're going to do. He knows they're going to refuse to surrender, and he knows that all this is going to happen to them, and he can do nothing to stop it because he values their freedom just like he values yours and mine. There was a huge debate in the church for 500 years. It's still in conversation today. I think it's not anywhere near the tempo of conversation it was for the first 500 years as to whether God could suffer. Well, it seems pretty clear to me as Jesus weeps over this city that God can feel pain. He can suffer. Then Jesus' pity turns to rage. That's a whole different conversation here. He comes into the temple and he starts to drive out all of those who were buying and selling in the temple. Now, why did he do that? What's going on there that is causing him to be so enraged? Well, if you were a Jew, this is Passover week. And that's one of the festivals that you as a Jew are supposed to, you're obligated to be in Jerusalem on Passover week if you can possibly get there. For a couple of reasons. One, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. The other is there's a temple tax, 1/2 shekel a year that every Jew was supposed to pay. And most of the Jews who paid the temple tax would come on Yom Kippur because why not? I mean, you're in Jerusalem, there you are, you paid the temple tax, you come and you make the sacrifices for your family. Well, if you come into the temple and you make a sacrifice for your family prior to Yom Kippur, you come up to the temple with a sacrifice. Well, you've got to bring it or buy it. Most Jews traveling would come in and they would buy it. There were vendors outside the walls of Jerusalem, Greco-Roman vendors, who would sell you a dove or a lamb or whatever. And you could buy your sacrifice outside, bring it in, hand it to the priest, and the priest would then inspect it. They inspected them. Why? Go back and read your Old Testament, Leviticus. It's got to be a spotless sacrifice. Well, you buy outside the temple, it might be or it might not be. So you come into the temple with one with a spot and they say, sorry, this one's rejected. What do? You buy one in the temple. They were called the booths of Annas, which he was the high priest at the time, and they were booths where they bought and they sold, and they also changed money. So you come in with your drachma and your Greco-Roman coinage and you say, I want to buy a dove in the temple. The reason people would buy their sacrifices outside the temple is because inside the temple they cost 15 times as much. Why? Because they were safe. You're guaranteed it's going to be a sacrifice that's fit to go in as a sacrifice for your family's sins. So you want to buy a safe one, right? You don't want to take a chance. So you come in, you pay 15 times more than the same sacrifice outside. They kept a herd, the Jews kept a herd of 250,000 sheep near the temple just for the sacrificial process in the temple throughout the year. So you've bought this sacrifice. Well, guess what? If you come in there, everybody outside of Jerusalem, and really everybody outside the Levites, bought and sold with Greco-Roman coinage. You can't use that in the temple. You can't use it. It's illegal. You cannot buy anything inside the temple. You can't pay an offering. You can't pay your temple tax. You have to have your money changed. And there were booths set up for that. Well, you would think, I would think, that they would just change it dollar for dollar if we speak in modern terms, right? No. You would bring your drachma or whatever Roman coinage you had, and they would trade it with you for shekels that you could use in the temple, but they would trade it at a profit. The money changers, on average, made about $15,000 during Passover week. Wow. So it was a big business, Passover week, for the temple. Think about it now if you're poor. If your family is a subsistence income family, agrarian, most of them were agrarian, and you live at a subsistence level, think what it costs you in terms of your family's life to come into this place where you've got to change money and buy a temple-regulated sacrifice at an inflated price just because. Think for a minute. You know what the number one snipe against the church is? There are two. Number 1 and 2. Number 2 is we're all hypocrites. To which I say, yeah, I mean, I'm definitely one. So you got me there. The other is, number 1, they just want my money. Now you come to Jew, you come to Passover because that's the obligated feast. I mean, you're obligated to that. If it's at all possible, you come and you see this extortion taking place. You grow up like that. How do you think you or I would think about God's character? Right? I mean, you think about the people, I had neighbors in our neighborhood, we took their children to church, we brought them, they would not come. And what was the reason? They just want my money. That's their perception of the church. Do you think that wouldn't be the Jewish perception after you know that all this is taking place at a profit? Sure it would be. Sure it would be. And this took place, and so Jesus, I would encourage anybody who wants to understand how God looks at justice, just get your Old Testament out and read the book of Amos. Very short, take you 20 minutes to read it, top to bottom. And you will see that God does not at all look upon lightly this kind of injustice toward the poor. Not at all. So the poor were being exploited to worship. Think of that. That's exactly what, I mean, we think about it in terms of the modern church today. That's exactly what the perception is of you and me as believers. They just want my money. Well, maybe they're not so unjustified in that perception, perhaps. And you sure wouldn't be if you lived in the time that Jesus does this in the temple. So, this all speaks then as we funnel it down to you and to me. We looked last week at the reasons why as Americans we don't want a king, right? George Washington said, I'll not serve a third term because I don't want to be perceived to be a king. We just went to war to get rid of that. That was very noble. But what about when it comes to Jesus? What about when it comes to our ability to hear God when He speaks into our life today as King? Jesus, when he stood over Jerusalem, He looked at them and He said, those things that would give you peace. He's saying, this idea that you have of the Messiah is so wrong. It's geopolitical, and I'm not here to do a geopolitical thing at all. And so He knows that the Jews' zeal toward independence of the Romans is going to cause them to pursue Messiah as geopolitical, and He knows that the Romans are going to win. They are not going to defeat the Roman Empire. He knows they're going to fail. You and I walk through this world. We talked about it a little bit in Sunday school today. We walk through it, as Solzhenitsyn said, with a line right through the middle of our hearts. And that line is the dividing line between good and evil. And it runs through every human heart, whether born again or not. There was, back in the early part of the 20th century, Time magazine put out a all-points bulletin to every philosopher, college professor, priest, pastor, writer, luminary, intellectual luminary they could find to say, send us your essays as to answer the question, what's wrong with the world? This was in the early 1900s. G.K. Chesterton, the British author, sent his essay in. His essay said, Dear Sirs, I am. And that was the end of the essay. That good and evil runs through every heart in this room, every person on this planet. Jesus comes as Messiah to be king, but He doesn't come as the conquering king. He wept over the city, and I just have to say, I am sure that He's weeping over humanity still today. As Nancy pointed out, the violence in this world, and not just that, the violence in our homes, the violence in our hearts toward one another. I think about it this way. I think, wouldn't it be great if just the church, and when I say the church, I mean the body of believers worldwide, were really surrendered to Jesus as King? Think what that would do in terms of the way those outside belief would look at us. They would be drawn to us, not repulsed by us. They would be drawn to see believers living in peace. Isn't it interesting? If you think about what people want in the world, People say, well, maybe somebody wants fame. They don't want the fame for the fame. They want the fame for the feeling of peace that it brings to have the fame. They don't want the money just for the money. Who wants to just sit on a pile of money and count it? Although that does sound appealing now that I think about it. But they want the peace that having that pile of money brings, right? They're looking for that peace. Everybody's looking for it in some way or another. Practice yoga, practice whatever. Do whatever you can to push down the sound of those things that take away peace. Jesus comes to the city of Jerusalem and says, the things that would bring you peace, I'm offering them to you, but you won't take them. He says the same thing to us. What things in our life do we glom onto, hold on to, refuse to let go of, wherein the peace that he wants us to have, we won't take it. We won't take it. Why? Because what we're holding on to looks more appealing than the peace we really want. Jesus comes as a king. Even omnipotence has to surrender to love. Isn't that something? Omnipotence, all power, God has to surrender to love. Jesus conquers by the force of love. How does he do it? He gives himself for the beloved. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything about